I'm extremely grateful to the Breakthrough Science Society for having invited me to Ernakulam to give this talk. I'm conscious of the honor that has been done to me by this invitation, and I hope I don't let you down by what I have to say. I must express my gratitude in particular to Dr. Rajivan and Dr. Harikumar for having acted as my hosts and as the potentiators of my coming here. Thank you very much to thank you for the nice words spoken to introduce me, Dr. Babu. Let me begin by telling you in brief what it is I hope to get across. The title has two keywords: evolution. The second keyword is us. So basically I want to talk about evolution to try and get across to you in what manner it forms the central organizing principle of all of biology, which means the central organizing principle concerning everything that has to do with life, living forms, or as I should refer to it, living matter, of which we here are examples. So that's going to be part of it. And the second part of it, intertwined with the first, is going to be an attempt to get across to you the ways in which we human beings have, sometimes intentionally and consciously, is that okay? I'm audible? Sometimes intentionally and consciously, sometimes unintentionally, played a major role in the evolution not only of ourselves but of living forms in general on this earth. So these are the 2 points I'd like to get across to you. One, what is evolution? And secondly, how we have in some ways been at the heart of evolutionary change, obviously ever since we came on the earth, which is really quite recently, relatively speaking, but nonetheless we have been responsible for a great deal that has gone on within this short period of time. The aim of science generally, of course, is to understand the world, to see what there is around us and to try and make sense of it. Scientific endeavors probably began with an attempt to understand the physical world, what you might call the non-living world, and people started out by trying to look for order, look for pattern, and then try and look for explanations behind that order and pattern in the non-living world. Here you see an example of minerals, and we today can say that we understand why they have particular crystal forms, why they have particular colors, why they have certain properties and so forth, by using the principles of physics. So this is one of the kinds of things that we'd like to understand in the non-living world. The other kind of thing, of course, consists not so much of structure, not so much of forms, as of behavior, of things that happen. So the moon rises up and sets in the sky. It also goes through various phases. Similarly, the sun rises and sets, and at some stage people knew that the heavens moved around, the stars seemed to move around the earth. It came to be realized that planets move around the sun, and so on and so forth. So there are phenomena that happen. Of course, there are more familiar phenomena like water flowing down into the sea, things like stones falling down if you let them go at some height. So these things too were the concern of science, of physical science, of trying to understand, trying to make sense of the non-living world. The explanations for all of these things, if one were to compress them to something very, very succinct, would say that our understanding of the non-living world is based on what we call laws of nature, and there are many examples of such laws which we learn in elementary school and high school. Newton's laws of motion are a familiar example. Then there are the laws of ideal gases, Boyle's law and Charles's law and so on. And similarly, like the laws of nature, like the laws of Newton and Boyle and Charles and so forth, we also have other laws which in some may come from them, and today one speaks of the laws of quantum mechanics or the principles of quantum mechanics as explaining everything that happens in the non-living world. So basically we have a set of short principles with the help of which we seem to have a reasonably good understanding of the non-living world, both in terms of its form, meaning in terms of what it consists of, as well as in terms of the behavior that it exhibits. However, in addition to these laws, in many cases, to understand the details of what's going on, we also have to invoke, we also have to assume what there was at the beginning. So there are certain phenomena whose understanding depends on what there was at the start, and then how the laws of nature applied to these phenomena cause them to proceed. The simplest example of this is the path of a stone falling down when you let go. Clearly the details of that falling down depend on the height at which you let go of it, the height at which you dropped it, whether you dropped it from rest or you dropped it with some speed, and so on and so forth. Of course, the law of nature which decides the rest of its falling down is the law of gravity, Newton's inverse square law of gravitation, by which the earth and the stone attract each other according to a certain mathematical formula. But to the law of gravity you have to add what there was at the beginning in order to understand the detailed, in order to explain the detailed part of that story. So I roughly call that past history, which is the initial condition and anything else that happened to the stone. This business of past history being important to understand properties is very well known by metallurgists, for example. So the way they work with a metal, the series of temperature changes, the series of pressure changes and so on that they take it through ultimately determines the properties of the finished product that they have. And we know this again from our school reading when we know of the different treatments that can be applied to iron, which results in different properties, and we learn of words like pig iron and ferrous iron and so on and so forth. What about the living world now? The first thing that strikes one about the living world is that in terms of forms, the range is enormous. There is nothing in the non-living world to compare with the diversity of the living world. And there are certain problems in understanding that diversity, to which I will come right at the end. But this goes without saying. The members of the living world come in different sizes. So some of the things on the board there are bacteria, which are 1/100th of a millimeter in size. There are amoebae there, which are probably about 1/10th of a millimeter to 1/50th of a millimeter in size. Then there are slightly larger cells, there are plants, there are animals of different sizes, there are trees, which can, of course, they're not illustrated here, but the giant trees can rise up to many tens of meters. So you have a huge range of sizes, huge range of forms, huge range of properties, even as you look at things without trying to see their behavior. And then, of course, you have a huge range of behaviors. The first thing that strikes you when you look at these forms of the living world and the behaviors seen in the living world is that at first sight they seem very surprising. Surprising in what sense? Surprising in the sense that nothing that you know about the physical world prepares you to come to grips with the range of forms, the range of properties and the range of phenomena that you see in the non-living world. And yet you know that the explanation for everything you see in the non-living world must be those same physical laws. There is really nothing else that we have to deal with, that we have to work with, which can act as an explanatory principle. So how can the same set of things that gives rise to a non-living world, to a physical world, which seems to be classifiable into a reasonable number of forms, which seems to be understandable by means of a reasonably small set of general principles, how does that give rise to this astonishing diversity, both of forms as well as behaviors? By the way, the behavior you see on the screen, of course, is not simply that there's a bird sitting in the crocodile's mouth. but that the bird is that crocodile's dentist. The crocodile opens its mouth in order to get its teeth cleaned. Now, that in itself appears surprising. What is even more surprising, and here I must say that not much work has been done on the bird-crocodile association, but a great deal has been done on similar associations involving birds and fishes, where once again the birds act as, so to speak, dentists. This particular behavior in the case of fishes, where it has been studied, turns out to hold good in particular places, particular locations. So there's something like the dentist clinic where this happens. If the bird gets into the fish's mouth at a place other than the proper clinic, the fish simply eats the bird. After all, the fish is normally both a fish eater as well as a bird eater, this fish in question. So it has to happen in the right place, and it also has to happen at the right time. So there are certain times during which these fish congregate, come there, lie in the water, half in the water with their mouths open, which is when the birds do their job of dentistry. The dentistry, of course, is getting rid of parasites, leeches very often, which find their place inside the fish's mouth, or in this case the crocodile's mouth, and obviously do it harm. So these two are helping each other. The bird cleans the fish's mouth or the crocodile's mouth, and in turn gets food for itself. What about the explanation for this astonishing range of forms and phenomena? Well, as I said, we have the same two explanations to begin with, which is the laws of nature, and we have to use the same laws of nature here and see how they can be applied to give rise to these forms and phenomena. And then you have initial conditions, past history, which has led up to this situation. As you can see, especially given the fact that certain things happen in certain places in certain times, but not in other times and at other places, you can see from that there must be some background to whatever you're seeing. So past history comes. In addition, and this is where biology marked a radical shift from physical science about 150 years ago, now more like 165 years ago. The third explanatory principle which crops up in biology, in the science of living matter, is called the principle of natural selection. Now, this is not something mysterious which is outside physics and chemistry. It doesn't make use of any laws of nature outside those of physics and chemistry. But the principle of natural selection says there is something else going on in the living world which involves the properties of living creatures, which ultimately results in these kinds of things. So what I'm going to do now is to try and illustrate to you how the principle of natural selection plus those other two principles that I've put down there, the laws of nature as in physics and chemistry, right? And it turns out something for which you do not need to give any special explanation whatsoever, namely sheer chance, or as people sometimes say, randomness, also plays a role in biological phenomena. Randomness plays a role in physical phenomena as well, and it becomes particularly important in situations in physics which involve transformations of form from one state to another, to what are called phase transformations. So I'll tell you a little bit about how randomness or chance plays a role in biology as well, how conventional physics and chemistry might play a role in biology, and then of course what this new principle is called natural selection, which seems to be central to biology but doesn't exist in the non-living world. So evolution basically is the broad explanation or the broad word which we use for all of those kinds of explanations that I mentioned a moment ago. Chance, laws of nature, and natural selection. Whenever any one or more of these explanatory principles leads to a change in the living world, a change that you can recognize, a change that is heritable, you call that change evolution. And it turns out that this evolution is the central fact of life. As a distinguished biologist Dobzhansky put it many years ago, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So, the evolution of something is the key to understanding what it is. This is the central principle of biology. I give you two examples which tie in evolution with what I said at the beginning, namely the fact that we human beings have had a hand in it. This cartoon illustrates the evolution of sugar cane, the common sugar cane, which is the source of the refined sugar that many people, human beings, continue to eat today. The history of the sugar cane plant is fascinating because it turns out to involve human history long before anything that we can think of as conventional history. In fact, it goes back to the very beginnings of what is called the Neolithic Revolution, when human beings started to domesticate plants and animals about 10,000 years ago. But much before that, it turns out that the sugarcane plant has been changing its properties and has been changing its form under natural forces, under whatever happens in the external environment, changes in temperature, changes in location because it is carried by the sea from one place to another and so forth, until it reached a stage about 10,000 years ago when human beings were able to consciously breed from sugarcane to improve varieties. And it's been a very long history, continuing in fact up to very much the recent day. And I mentioned sugarcane particularly because a very distinguished scientist from Kerala, Janaki Ammal, had a main role in the modern development of sugarcane varieties to the form, to the state in which we use it. Another example. This involves pigeons which have been bred by pigeon fanciers. So starting out from the common dove, from the kind of bird that we see all around us, especially in cities associated with human beings, people, for their own fancy, bred varieties which had these bizarre shapes that you see on the screen, purely out of fancy. And they did it consciously, intentionally, by simply using as mating pairs in every generation those birds which resembled in some faint degree the form that they were trying to get. So this was rather interesting, both in the case of sugarcane as well as in the case of these fancy pigeons. What people did is to have some kind of end in mind. In the case of the sugarcane, there were really two ends in mind. One was to try and get something which was sweeter and sweeter, much sweeter than honey, for example, which was the common sweetener before sugarcane. So something which was sweeter and sweeter, and secondly, something which could be transported easily by converted to a solid form. In fact, the crystallization of sugarcane turns out to have been a major problem in its development as an industrial product. And that crystallization too, it turns out, was discovered in India sometime around the year 300 to 400 AD, but still a very, very long time ago. So those things had to be solved and selective breeding had to be carried out. The same thing was done with these pigeons, and here you have something called a pouter pigeon, which is on the left, which is purely fancy to look at. On the right hand side you have something remarkable called a tumbling pigeon or a tumbler pigeon as it's known, and its property is that as it flies, like a circus artist, it tumbles over backwards before continuing its flight. Now it turns out that this is due to a neurological disorder in it which people didn't know about, but by selective breeding and by seeing that occasionally even the common pigeon shows this kind of funny flight behavior, by selective breeding people were able to get tumbler pigeons which would tumble regularly. So my point simply is to say that human beings, by conscious selection, have managed to change living forms rather successfully. Not only have they done that, they have done that in remarkably short times. A more familiar example, of course, to all of us is the domesticated dog, which comes in a huge variety of types. And if you look at pictures or know the behavior of a bulldog, for example, and then of a lapdog, Pomeranian, or something called a Pekingese, or an Alsatian, or a sheepdog, all of these look very different, have very different properties, but they were all generated by selective breeding within a few human lifetimes by human beings acting consciously. In fact, examples such as these are what motivated Darwin, it turns out, in coming up with his theory of natural selection. In other words, the idea that humans could do this within short times. I'll come to this in somewhat detail later. This is an example where human intervention has had a completely unwanted and completely disastrous effect. And the intervention here was to try and control rabbits in Australia. So around the middle of the last century, around the year 1940 or thereabout, 1930s and 1940s, it had become recognized that rabbits were a huge pest. Their numbers were essentially flying sky high. In order to control them, a virus was introduced into Australia called the myxoma virus, and there have been many outcomes of this, which I will tell you a little bit more about later. The outcome of interest to us, which illustrates the principle of natural selection, is that this myxoma virus succeeded in killing rabbits initially. That's the purpose for which it was brought in. But over the course of time, its success kept decreasing. And today, the virus turns out to be a benign virus. So the virus has kept decreasing in virulence. Why that has happened is something we look at. Those of you who remember the COVID episode as it has unfolded before our own eyes know that this has happened with COVID as well. A pretty virulent virus at the beginning. By the time the second, third and fourth waves came around, had become less and less virulent. Okay, now I come to explanations. As I said, there are three broad explanations for evolution that one invokes. One is standard physics and chemistry, laws of nature, as I said at the beginning. Then there's sheer chance, and finally natural selection. Standard physics and chemistry has been invoked in many cases to explain evolutionary form, to explain regularities, patterns which you find in living creatures, which seem to resemble in certain ways the kinds of patterns that you find in non-living creatures too. So this illustrates many cases in which you have periodic patterns. The most familiar for us consists of the 5 digits on our hand. So you can think of these 5 digits as being equivalent in terms of pattern, equivalent to the stripes on a zebra's back, or to the stripes on a tiger's back, right? Or with some imagination, to the repeated form of the petals around the flower, something which repeats time and time again. And there are many such patterns that you see in nature, especially in skin color. So you not only stripe, you also have spots, which are periodic or reasonably periodic repetitions of dot-like patterns instead of being striped. All of these can in principle be explained by standard physics and chemistry, which is to say, they can be explained by saying that there is an underlying physics and chemistry which people are reasonably familiar with. It involves concepts like feedback, it involves concepts like catalysis, especially autocatalysis and cross-catalysis. Using these concepts, you can write down simple chemical equations, and when you solve those equations, you find that the chemicals in question are distributed in the form of stripes, or distributed in the form of spots, or distributed in the form of a combination of spots and stripes and so forth. Now, the question is, this is very well as far as the formal resemblance goes. But does that really happen in these cases? Well, very interestingly, it turns out that in many cases it does, and we have reasonably good candidates for what the underlying chemicals are which give rise to these stripe kinds of patterns or spot kinds of patterns. In other cases, you have the same kind of pattern but due to entirely different reasons. And in fact, it turns out that there is no such reaction diffusion chemistry, that's a technical term. There is no such reaction diffusion chemistry responsible for it, but rather there is some other pretty involved mechanism but with the same end goal, meaning with the same end point, I shouldn't say goal, same end point, which is spots or stripes. Which is also a nice way of showing that so long as something is evolutionarily advantageous, it can evolve, but there is more than one way for it to evolve. So one of those ways was by means of standard chemistry, which I, for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to call ordinary physics, the laws of physics. But another way seems to involve some kind of special working going on within the system which leads to the same end. Here's an example of where natural selection has turned out to be the best explanation for something that's happened in evolution. The evolutionary phenomenon in this case is that many people have hemoglobin, which is the oxygen carrying protein in the blood. Many people have hemoglobin which is defective, meaning this hemoglobin cannot carry oxygen as effectively as ordinary oxygen does. Therefore, the supply of oxygen to their system is less than what it should be, less than optimal. Therefore, they suffer from what's called anemia, which is of course caused by many other reasons, but ultimately it's due to a lack of delivery of oxygen to the tissues. This form of anemia has a special name, it's called sickle cell anemia. That's because the red blood cells in which this defective hemoglobin is have a sickle type of shape. So, and the trait is also sometimes called sickling. So this, it turns out, has happened in the course of evolution. Question is, why has it happened? Someone, a person called Allison, together with a distinguished scientist who came to India and did quite a bit of interesting work here, J.B.S. Haldane, noticed that the areas of the world where sickle cell anemia was common seemed to overlap with the areas of the world where malaria was common. So they saw that there is this association between sickling and malaria. They probed a bit further, Allison in particular, and discovered that this sickle cell trait, which is a defective due to a defective hemoglobin, which is due to a defective gene that makes hemoglobin, they discovered that the sickle cell trait, which is harmful normally, is actually beneficial if the neighborhood has malaria, if you live in a malaria prone area. And the reason for that is very curious. This defective hemoglobin certainly makes the person anemic, certainly deprives the person's tissues of oxygen. But at the same time, the red blood cells which make this defective hemoglobin are very bad for the malarial parasite. So the parasite itself cannot grow as effectively, cannot develop actually as effectively in these red blood cells as it can grow in normal red blood cells. So you have a balance of factors here. On the one hand, you have harm done by the anemia. On the other hand, you have benefit done by this defective hemoglobin because it is keeping the parasite away. In the absence of this defect in the hemoglobin, if you have normal red blood cells, the parasite grows effectively, you get malaria, and malaria can often also be fatal. You know this. So you are at the same time benefited and harmed, and it turns out that the balance permits a certain frequency, a certain proportion of individuals to carry this defective gene which persists in the population. This is a textbook example of how natural selection can work, not lead you to some kind of optimal outcome which is the best possible outcome under all circumstances, but to lead you to an outcome which is optimal under the circumstances in which that creature, or that in this case human beings, live, which happens to be a malaria-infested environment. Here's an example of chance, and this came about already some 50 years ago. When molecular biology was just beginning, which is to say, when people had started just then to work with DNA and proteins and had realized that DNA was necessary for making proteins, DNA specified proteins in some way, it didn't take long for them to realize, to come to the conclusion that if DNA was responsible for making proteins and proteins are responsible for making plants, animals, microorganisms and so forth, ultimately DNA must be in some sense responsible for making these organisms. Then someone whom we know better as a chemist, a person by the name of Linus Pauling, pointed out that if this was the case, and if evolution consisted of a change in the form and behavior of living organisms, then that change in form should be traceable back to proteins and of course also to DNA, to genes. So Linus Pauling pointed out that it might be possible to study evolution not by looking at how plants and animals change in time, but to look at how proteins change in time. Now, it turns out, strangely enough, that it's much easier in some ways to study how proteins change and how DNA changes rather than how actual plants and animals change. Let me take a minute to tell you why this is so, because this turns out to be one of the central features of molecular biology as it is being done today, which is to try and answer evolutionary questions. The reason is simply the following. The only material that you have to available to work with if you're doing biology is plants and animals, bacteria, microbes, which are around you now. You can't study dead creatures, quite obviously, apart from the fact that they don't stay very long. Only very few, a handful get fossilized, but the fate awaiting most living creatures, including us, is decay, pure and simple. So there's really nothing available there for you to study, and you certainly can't study creatures from the past. But in a strange way, you can study proteins from the past, and you can study DNA from the past. In fact, some of you may have read that not long ago, the Nobel Prize in Biology was awarded for the study of ancient human DNA. Now, how can you do that? One way, of course, is to look for fossils and to look for DNA from fossils. Another very clever way makes use of the following kind of reasoning. DNA is in some senses like a language. So you can speak of letters in DNA, you can speak of words in DNA, you can speak of sentences in DNA. So the fact that living creatures are very different is analogous to the fact that there are many different languages in the world. Now, students of linguistics realized long ago that the languages of the world show certain patterns which enables us to group them into families, then into subfamilies, even closer groups and so forth, and to try and infer what the structure of the languages in those families was, in the ancestral families was. Now, it's not a straightforward matter, but linguists try and do that. Turns out, especially thanks to the use of computers, when you have your language in the form of letters, almost literally, as you do in the case of DNA, it's not difficult, or I should say it's not impossible, to try and infer what letters were ancestral to these sets of letters, what letters were ancestral to those sets of letters, and so forth. So one can reconstruct old DNA, reconstruct ancient DNA reasonably well, and once one has done that, one can go back to other data like fossil data and say, okay, this is what the reconstructed DNA of a common ancestor of human beings and monkeys looked like. So I have those letters. Now you can go back to people who do fossil biology and ask them, when did this common ancestor live? And they'll give you the answer, 10 million years ago, 20 million years ago, 30 million years ago, whatever it is. And you can do this for any animals you want or any plants you want. So now you have two pieces of information. You have a guessed ancient DNA sequence, you have the present day DNA sequence, and you have a time. So it's a simple matter now to look at the change in these DNA sequences, divide that by the time that has elapsed, and you immediately get the rate at which that DNA sequence has evolved. It's essentially dividing distance by time. When people first did that under the influence of Pauling, as I said, something remarkable came out, which is that all these curves, so these show distance in evolutionary terms as a function of time for three different proteins. You can see that each of those curves looks like a straight line. It's almost as if each of these proteins has been evolving in a clock-like fashion, with so many ticks per unit time, and time has elapsed, evolutionary time has elapsed for these proteins, and therefore of course also for the DNA behind those proteins, at a constant rate. The explanation of this came from some very clever reasoning by a Japanese mathematical biologist called Muto Kimura, who pointed out that this is exactly what you would expect if the bulk of DNA in living organisms, and therefore the bulk of proteins in living organisms, were evolving purely by chance, by a mechanism which technically is called a random walk, which all of us have studied in school as Brownian movement. So something like the movement of pollen grains in a bowl of water, which looks erratic without any definite direction, can be described by the mathematics of this random walk, and that turns out to be responsible for this evolutionary change. The implication of this finding was profound because it led to the conclusion that in spite of the obvious changes in form and the obvious meaningful changes that have occurred in evolution, and I gave you two examples a while ago. One was these stripe-like patterns which probably are responsible for our digits. Then I gave you the example of sickle cell malaria. Those things have happened, there's no doubt of that. In spite of that, there's a background rate of ticking, if you wish to call it that, of the evolutionary clock, which is purely a chance phenomenon. So you have chance working at the same time or in parallel with something meaningful, which is leading to change. And this is something that we have now come to recognize and in fact make use of, because if there's a clock, obviously you can now use it. Now that you've shown that there's a clock, you can use it to tell the time. And now people, in fact, quite often look at DNA sequences and use them to say how long ago that particular creature lived. So turn the reasoning upside down. Okay, so how does, better take a look at time. How am I doing for time? About 20 minutes more, let go. Nice. Okay, so how does natural selection work? We know how chance works. I've told you that this is, at least in the simplest kind of case, it's exactly like a random walk or Brownian movement mechanism. We know how that works. How does physics and chemistry work? How does stripe sort of patterning work? We know the chemistry behind that as well. At least we know the chemical kinds of chemical equations that you need for that. How does natural selection work? This, of course, was the fundamental insight of Darwin and Wallace, as I said, 170 odd years ago. Basically, natural selection depends on living creatures having certain properties. And the properties, very briefly, are variation. The living creatures must differ from each other. Heritability, which means that these differences must be passed on to their children. Coupled with variation and heritability, what is called differential reproduction, which is that some individuals have more children than others, and the reason they have more children than others is because of differences in these properties that we spoke of, and as we said, those differences are heritable. So these three fundamental assumptions, I repeat the word assumptions, are sufficient for evolution to take place, and Darwin and Wallace showed that quite convincingly, and this has turned out to be, as I said, the central organizing principle of biology. But how do we know those assumptions are valid? After all, you're not doing mathematics here. You can't simply write down a set of assumptions, deduce certain conclusions, and then say, I've finished. You have to somehow relate this to what is happening in the real world. So the business of evolutionary biology, in fact, what evolutionary biologists like me and many others do most of the time, is to see whether these assumptions are valid, to see whether these assumptions are correct. Because if they are not correct, natural selection cannot work. Evolutionary change cannot happen in this way. Fortunately for us, it turns out that in a great many cases the evolutions are valid. Therefore we think, yes, these are genuine properties of living organisms, and therefore they serve as useful explanatory properties for evolution. But as I've already told you, there are situations in which there may be other reasons behind evolution. And I repeat, chance and ordinary physics and chemistry without natural selection may be sufficient. In most cases, however, that have been studied in detail, it seems to be natural selection that is at work. A very simple cartoon to introduce the central idea behind natural selection. This was prepared by an Irani friend of mine, and I keep using it ever since. I heard him use this at a talk. The principle is simply the following. There's a tiger. The tiger is chasing two runners. Obviously, both of them want to avoid being eaten. One of the runners tells the other, look, it's no use. We can't run faster than the tiger. This running away doesn't do any good. Then the second runner points out, I'm not trying to run faster than the tiger, I'm trying to run faster than you. This is the central principle behind natural selection, which is that what is going on, in this case rather explicitly, but in other cases implicitly, is a competition between different members of the same species for who is more effective at leaving behind children. Staying alive in this case, but you have to stay alive to have children, of course. So it's that kind of implicit competition for what's called reproductive success, and the technical word for this is fitness. So sometimes you may have heard the phrase survival of the fittest. Rather complicated phrase really, but in its simple form, put down to basics, this is what it involves. It means taking part in an implicit competition to have children and coming off better than others, that's all. Not doing the best of all, right? Not doing better than someone who is not competing with you, but doing better than others who are competing with you. So for example, here these two runners are competing with each other. If you have foxes that are chasing rabbits, the competition is on the one hand between rabbits to be most successful in escaping from foxes, and on the other hand among foxes to be the most effective in hunting down rabbits. So in this picture, from the rabbit's point of view, the fox is simply there as a general threat, background threat, common threat to everyone. The rabbits are not competing with the foxes for anything, they are only competing with themselves. Similarly, as far as the foxes are concerned, the rabbits are there available as a meal. They don't care whether they get rabbit A or rabbit B. The competition between the foxes for who is most effective at catching rabbits. So this is a cartoon representation of natural selection. I'll give you a few illustrations. These are all textbook examples. The picture at the left and the picture at the right both show you the same couple of moths. By same I mean same, literally. In one case they were put on a slightly mottled background on the left. In the right case they were put on a black background. In fact, I had to do this every time to find out for myself. In the left picture I can see the black moth very easily. In the right picture I can see the white moth very easily. But on the left I don't see the black moth, I don't see the white moth well at all. And on the right I can barely make out the black moth. Probably you can as well. Those of you who have very sharp eyesight might be able to see the white moth on the left as well. The point is simply the following. These are the same two moths. They illustrate a phenomenon which has become famous in the history of biology as industrial melanism. The phenomenon is the following. In Northwest Europe, including Great Britain, where much of this surveying was done, the following change was noticed in the population of moths as the Industrial Revolution progressed. And this is a particular species of moth. The genus is called biston. In this biston moth, most moths that were found by wildlife enthusiasts and collectors were white colored. Then as the Industrial Revolution started spreading, the color of the moth started changing and people started reporting fewer and fewer white moths and more black moths. It took a long time for the mystery to be solved, and once again it was solved by the same person whose name I used before, J.B.S. Haldane. But he did this much before coming to India, sometime in the 1930s, 20s and 30s in fact. Haldane pointed out that before the Industrial Revolution, the trees in those forests where the moths were found were light colored. Many of them had whitish barks, light colored barks. So a moth which was also white, which settled on those barks, escaped attack by birds because the birds could not see it. It was camouflaged by the tree. But with the onset of the Industrial Revolution, soot, carbon, started coating the barks of these plants, which consequently started turning darker and darker. These white colored moths became more and more visible to birds, which consequently started feeding on them. But moths which by chance had acquired a black color, because a mutation had occurred in the white colored moth, managed to escape. So these black colored moths, which were extremely rare to start with, now because of their escape from predation, started to increase in numbers, and at the peak of the Industrial Revolution, practically no white moths could be found. They were all black. What is interesting is that in contemporary times, as public awareness about pollution has taken hold and factory chimneys have started to become taller and taller and filters have started to be installed and so forth, the levels of soot on these trees has decreased and the white colored moths have started coming back. The interesting point here of course is that both this white and black moth are the same species. In fact, its genetics has also been worked out. They differ by a single gene. This is one of the most dramatic examples of evolution that we know of, where a single gene is behind the change that has occurred, and the change is also reversed. So it has occurred in both directions. That was an example of natural selection. What about chance? Well, chance by its very definition does not have a cause in the usual sense of the term. Chance operates whenever outcomes are not rigidly predetermined, and in the biological context, chance operates whenever populations are small. So I'll give you a simple example. If you have a population of 1 million, and among those million people, 500,000 are dark colored and 500,000 are light colored, and both of them on average have the same numbers of children who are colored like the parents, like one of the parents, then you can see that in the course of time, you will have about 500,000 light colored children and 500,000 dark colored children. That will continue forever. Nothing will happen. That is when the population was 1 million strong. Instead of 1 million, suppose the population had only 4 people, 2 of whom were light colored, 2 of whom were dark colored. Then all kinds of things can happen. Purely by chance, the light colored individuals may not have any children. In which case, in the next generation, all the children will be dark colored, and from then on the population will be entirely dark colored. You see the point? So when there are small numbers, chance events can happen which change the average pattern in the population. And of course, in the case of evolution, you would count it as evolutionary change. So just to make it understandable, I've called this the law of small numbers, like the law of large numbers. The law of large number tells you that if you toss a fair coin a huge number of times, about half the times it will come heads and half the time it will come tails. The law of small numbers, so to speak, tells you that if you toss that same coin a very small number of times, let's say 2 times, then you may get both heads. If it's 4 times, all 4 may be head, or you may get 3 heads and 1 tail. So you can get significant differences from the average result if the number of trials is small. And in biology, the equivalent of number of trials being small is number of individuals being small. And this is an example, a biological example, comes from a group known as the Amish in the US, who turn out to have a huge number of individuals with 6 fingers on each hand. Now, this is a, let's say, not a completely unknown phenomenon in human beings elsewhere. I think many of us must have come across people like that sometime or other. In the case of the Amish, it so happened that their sect or their group was founded by a single couple, both of whom had 6 fingers on their hands, and this trait turns out to be heritable. Therefore, all their children had 6 children on their hands, and in the course of time, everyone has 6 fingers, beg your pardon, on their hands. So here is a change, a drastic change, which has occurred in this population, and the cause is really chance. There's no real identifiable cause in the usual sense, except to say that in the beginning, you had only individuals with 6 fingers who started the population. A few features of evolution before I come to an end. I've already said that evolution can work in different ways towards the same end. This is a rather nice example. I'm afraid you'll have to stare at the pictures very closely to see the difference between the two. One of them shows our eye, or if you wish, a mammalian eye in a cross section. The other shows the eye of a mollusk. So something like a snail or a squid, whichever, a molluscan eye. The colors and the patterns there show you the different features in the eye. So there's a lens, there are the muscles holding the lens in place, then there is the retina at the back, and there are nerve cells. And I want you to direct your attention in particular at which layer do I want you to look at. I want you to look at layer number 4. Okay? In both eyes. Notice, I beg your pardon, layer number 3 in both eyes. Notice that layer number 3 on the right hand side sticks to the back of the eye and then goes on and forms nerve cells. Is that clear? Goes back into the brain. The thing which is marked 3. Whereas the thing that is marked 3 on the left hand side begins as 4. If you see that sketch, it's marked 4. And then it makes a hole through the eye and goes to the back, and there it's called 3. That hole through the eye is what we call the blind spot. It's present in us. There's no such hole in the other eye, which is the mollusk eye. So we have the same nerve cells in the eye, we and the mollusks. These nerve cells perform the same function, which is initially to sense light, these are photoreceptors, and then to convey this sensation of light by means of electrical signals to nerve cells, and those nerve cells pass those electrical signals down to the brain. Except that in our case, the photoreceptor cells, the ones which sense light, are at the back of the eye, and the nerve cells which send it to the brain are at the front of the eye, which is crazy because the brain is at the back. So these photoreceptor cells have to first tell the nerve cells that they have sensed light, and the nerve cells have to tell that to the brain. But how can the nerve cells tell that to the brain without punching a hole in the eye? So they make the hole. And that hole is a blind spot, as I said, because there's nothing you can see there in that blind spot. There's no space for photoreceptors. These molluscan eyes are the other way around, which is the sensible way. They don't have a blind spot. Now, these two eyes are completely equivalent. The only reason it appears that this has happened is because the starting conditions in the molluscan eye, for whatever reason, we still don't understand this fully, seem to have been different from the starting conditions in our eyes. So you have the same, the molluscan eye presumably does the job of seeing as well as our eye does, but does it in a completely different way. And the reason it does it differently is simply because of past history, starting conditions, which are technically sometimes also called contingencies, the usual word contingent. Something happened because of it, this is different. Again, not causal in the usual sense of the term, right? But causal simply because it happened that way. Let me just see how many slides I have. Yeah, just 3. So, 2 stories and then a final summing up slide. The 2 stories are this. First, with the myxoma virus, which I already mentioned to you. Rabbits are not native to Australia. They were introduced in Australia sometime in the middle 1800s. People even give a date, I think it's 1859 or so. And they were introduced into Australia for hunting purposes. People thought this is a nice way of getting meat easily. So they brought rabbits over from Europe. What they did not realize is that if the rabbits went loose, they were initially kept in farms, raised in farms for meat, as I said. What they did not realize that if the rabbits go loose, they can breed very rapidly. And indeed, that happened. By around 1940, the estimate is that there were 600 million rabbits in Australia. So in less than 100 years, what had started as a handful, we don't know the exact numbers, but what had started as a smallish number had become 600 million, 60 crores of rabbits. And by that stage, the whole country had become frightened of these rabbits because they were major agricultural pests. Now they were being hunted just to get rid of them, not for food. But no amount of killing them by guns seemed to suffice. So the rabbits developed tricks of hiding from these hunters, this and that, kept increasing, kept damaging farm produce and so forth, crops. Then people said, look, let us go back to Europe and see whether there's a natural pest of rabbits that we can use to control them here. And indeed there was one. There's this thing called the myxoma virus. It turns out to be related, by the way, it's one of the pox viruses, similar to our chicken pox and smallpox viruses. So they brought the myxoma virus over. And again, the idea was to do this by inoculating some of these rabbits with the virus. The virus was known to be extremely virulent, hoping that the rabbits died, and then hoping that the virus would spread. It worked spectacularly. So from 1940, from about 600 million rabbits, there was a decline by something like 500 million in a decade or two. Spectacular death. So the rabbits just kept, sort of, as they say, dying like flies. But then something unusual happened. The rate of death slowed down, and it was obvious what was happening. The rabbits were developing resistance. They were evolving resistance. And people were getting worried, what shall we do now? Because they'll start breeding again. And in fact, they thought up something equally crazy, which was to bring in a second viral pest for these rabbits. They, in fact, actually introduced in Australia, and they ran into problems there as well. But I'm sticking to the myxoma virus here. So they discovered the rabbits are getting resistant. At the same time, they discovered that the virus was getting less virulent. And that surprised them a lot. Why is the virus becoming less effective? Why does evolution on the virus now? Remember, evolution is acting both on the rabbits and on the virus. The rabbits it's making resistant, that we understand. Why is it making the viruses less virulent? There it turned out that something interesting was happening, which is the following. How does the virus go from rabbit to rabbit? It seems to be transferred, as with the malaria parasite in our case, it seems to be transferred by the bite of a mosquito. And the critical point here is, mosquitoes are drawn to bite rabbits because of their body temperature, in the same way that they are drawn to bite us. This body temperature is a successful cue for telling a mosquito that this is a live rabbit, a biteable rabbit. The mosquito, of course, doesn't know anything about the virus, just as the mosquito knows nothing about malaria. But it bites the rabbit, or bites us in our case. As the virus was getting virulent and killing off rabbits, the rabbits were dying so early that the mosquitoes didn't have time to bite them, in a sense. So there were only dead rabbits all over the place. So the mosquitoes, which were an agent, or as one says, a vector, for transmitting the myxoma virus between rabbits, were no longer able to do their job effectively. Therefore, those viruses which became less virulent, right, were more successful in transmission. Do you get the argument? So long as the virus is less virulent, the rabbit lives longer. The longer the rabbit lives, the more successful the mosquito is at transmitting the virus. So from the virus's point of view, remember, for the virus, the mosquito is simply a train that it has to catch from going from one rabbit to another. So from the virus's point of view, a live rabbit is much better than a dead rabbit. A dead rabbit doesn't get it anywhere. So keeping the rabbit alive is in the virus's interest. Therefore, lowered virulence. So very intricate kind of picture. The Australians are still living with the problem, by the way, as I told you. The problem hasn't gone away. But the myxoma virus example is a nice way of showing how evolution can work in unexpected ways, in intricate ways, involving three actors now: the rabbit, the virus, and the malarial mosquito, and how it can lead to outcomes which are completely unplanned, simply because of the intricacy of the system. My last example. Those of you who have read the abstract will have seen this in a sentence somewhere, and I will expand on it here. So this is, you could call it almost like a Sherlock Holmes mystery. You could call it the case of the insect which died before it was born. Now, what's going on? The story is the following. This is an insect called a mite. Very tiny insect, it's probably a millimeter in size. I think all of us will have seen mites. You see them in our homes as well. It's a particular kind of mite, species Adactylium. This mite, this particular species of mite, has only one food, which is the egg of another insect, something called a thrips. Okay, the story is the following now. You have a female mite which is pregnant, she has mated, And in order to let the eggs develop successfully and in order to lay young successfully, she needs to feed herself. So she gets into this thrips egg and starts feeding on the egg. The egg of the host, of the thrips. Her own eggs are in her body developing. They get nutrition from this foreign egg that the mother is eating. Turns out that these eggs hatch in her body, inside the body. So they're not laid by the mother. So you have larval insects hatching, embryonic insects hatching inside the mother. Right? What do they do now? They start eating up the mother from inside. Gruesome enough. Second thing, turns out that these eggs are usually 8 or 9 or 10 in number. Only one of them is a male. The other 8 or 9 are female, his sisters. One brother, 8 sisters, or one brother, 9 sisters. Inside the mother, whom they are eating, and the reason for their eating the mother is for them to develop to maturity. They become mature. This male mates with each of his 8 sisters, impregnates them, and then dies. The sisters, after finishing eating up their mother, come out and then begin the life cycle again. Each of them is a pregnant female now. She does exactly what her mother did, or tries to do exactly what her mother did. So what's going on here? Turns out that the clue to understanding this behavior is this unusual sex ratio. I said one brother and 8 or 9 sisters. Normally, of course, the sex ratio is 50-50. Certainly in human beings, it's 50-50. And in a great many cases, we know it's 50-50. So the explanation for this strange behavior here turns out to be tied up with this extraordinary sex ratio of one male with whatever, large number of females. And this was deciphered, this mystery was deciphered by a person who I think it's fair to call the greatest evolutionary biologist of our times, a person called Hamilton, W.J. Hamilton, William Hamilton. Hamilton pointed out that there was no need for the sex ratio to be 1:1 when you had mating not on a population-wide scale, which happens in most cases we know, including in human beings by the way, meaning that in principle you can mate with anyone in the population of the opposite sex. But in this case, mating is restricted to within this very tiny population of 9 or 10 individuals. And Hamilton pointed out, the mathematics is not difficult, but I can't carry it through here in words. Hamilton pointed out that when mating takes place in such small local groups, then it makes sense to have as few males as possible and as many females as possible in order to maximize reproductive efficiency of the mother. So under those circumstances, the mother should see to it that she has only one son but many daughters, which she does. By the way, in insects this is possible, in many insects this is possible, that the mother chooses the sex of her child at the time the child is laid. So this is what is being done here. Again, an example of the really intricate way in which evolution proceeds, in which you have one strange phenomenon, all this business of eating through the mother and coming out, tied up with another strange phenomenon, which is this unusual sex ratio, one male to many females, and the two tie up so that it makes sense now. And this is again a feature of evolutionary studies. So now I'm finished. I want to say a few remarks at the end to just tell you what is happening in evolutionary biology today, and then I'll make a couple of general comments. Maybe I'll put that up here just for you to look at. So what are evolutionary biologists studying today? A great many things. Many of them are tied up with molecular biology, we're tied up with seeing how you can trace the link between DNA, proteins and evolution. In tracing this link, many fine problems, many problems of detail have been worked out. But there are some problems which are major problems which have faced us from the beginning of evolutionary theory, from the beginnings of evolutionary biology, which we are still trying to grapple with, which we have not worked out. So let me mention a couple of those major problems. The biggest, perhaps, is the basic question of how many species there are on Earth, why there are so many species, and why the actual number is whatever you see, and what accounts for these different varieties of species that you see. In other words, so many of this kind, so many of that kind, so many of that kind, and so forth. The same problem was faced by physicists a long time ago, and one answer to it was given in the form of what's called the periodic table, whose discovery by the Russian chemist Mendeleev told us that the naturally occurring elements on Earth are this many. Their number has gone up to 100 and something now, maybe 120, but still a smallish number. And then in the course of time, we began to understand why there are this many, but not more, and why they have precisely the properties they have. So this many types of gases, this many types of so-called, let's say, reactive alkali elements, this many type of non-reactive elements, this many noble gases, this many metals, this many whatever, you can name the properties of the elements. For that we have a theoretical explanation. Unfortunately, we don't have a comparable explanation in biology. So I'll tell you the most remarkable fact about biology. The largest number of types of living creatures, meaning largest numbers of living creatures belonging to a certain type that you can think of, are bacteria. Now, bacteria are also in some sense the simplest types of living creatures. One still doesn't know how many bacterial species there are, we can't count that well, but the guess is there may be perhaps 10 times as many as all the other species put together. Because in terms of population sizes, the bacteria are even bigger. I'm just talking about number of different varieties, so to speak. No explanation. Why is it that evolution, so to speak, at least in some of these lineages, seems to have stopped with bacteria and not got any further? Actually, if you want to look at it seriously, there are things even simpler than bacteria, except that people quibble over whether to call them alive or not. These are bacterial viruses. Just like we have viruses, bacteria have viruses too. They call them bacteriophages. They really are the largest number of creatures, if you are willing to call them living creatures, that are around. We don't know why. Even among the bigger living creatures, so let's look at plants. Flowering plants are many, many, many more than all other kinds of plants. Why? We don't know. Among animals, the most abundant types of animals are insects. Why? We don't know. There are ad hoc explanations, of course. You can always say, under these circumstances, in this climatic region, or in this kind of tropical rainforest, insects will do better than everyone else. But why the insects as a species have radiated that much, we don't know. In fact, I come back to J.B.S. Haldane again. He made a very amusing remark when he was asked this question. He was asked, why are there so many forms of insects? You are an evolutionary biologist, can you tell us? And Haldane is reported to have answered, well, I don't know the answer. All I can say is that if there is a God, he had a great love for insects. So he put it in terms of beetles and different words. But that, that's a kind of non-answer that even a person like Haldane came up with. So these big puzzles are one. Second big puzzle, I shouldn't call it second, another big puzzle that stays us in the faces. And I give you a couple of examples of this. Biological organization is extremely intricate, and this intricacy can be seen at the level of genes. So pretty much every gene in our body affects the functioning of every other gene. That intricacy is at the level of tissues. If something goes wrong with one tissue, it affects the second tissue because there are interconnections, you know this. And it also reflects a level of intricacy at the level of big ecosystems. And you saw a small example of that with that myxoma virus story. You try to tinker with one thing here, you change something else unexpected there. This intricacy of ecosystems must have been an evolutionary product. As I said, evolution is the one connecting thread through all of biology. But how has the intricacy come up? In other words, has there been evolution for making things intricate, or is it simply a byproduct of the kind of opportunistic evolution that we know has been occurring all the time? This still remains an open question. And the final point to which I will draw your attention has to do with the evolution of us human beings. Thanks to these advances in molecular biology, now it's become possible to trace human history, including human migrations, at a level which was impossible until recently. And some of the most fascinating answers that are, I shouldn't say answers, fascinating pieces of information, observations that are turning up, consist of human populations, for example, the Indian population, the genetic variation present in human populations, where that genetic variation came from, what that says about who our ancestors were, and so forth. This is something that evolutionary biologists these days are spending more and more time on. So I've ended my what I wanted to say formally there. I hope I've succeeded in getting across to you a little bit about what evolutionary biology consists of. But more importantly, I hope I've succeeded in conveying to you a sense of what makes it such a fascinating subject. It appears as if there is no part of the functioning of a living system which cannot be addressed by looking at it evolutionarily. So the evolutionary approach is an extraordinarily fertile approach in terms of the ideas it throws up, in terms of the questions it throws up, which one can answer. Given this, of course, given all of these, given this as a fact, assuming this to be true, it's tragic that in our country we seem to be downplaying the importance of evolution. There's a lot of nonsensical talk going on, and it's somewhat paradoxical in the sense that people don't seem to say that they don't believe in evolution. Rather, they seem to say that we knew of evolution all along. We Indians, since we knew everything, we also knew about evolution, and we don't need to learn it from anyone else. And in parallel with this, the scientific study of evolution is being pared down in textbooks. There was this whole NCERT scandal a year or so ago, with evolution being removed as a subject from, if I remember right, 10th standard textbooks or 9th standard textbooks. So all of that is a great pity. We have to realize that the study of evolution is an area of scientific study like any other area of science. It touches us very deeply. It in fact concerns us, it deals with us, and we should do whatever we can to try and persuade people that this is worth studying. Not doing that seems to me to be terrible mistake and something that future generations will blame us for. So on that less than very optimistic note, I thank you all for your patience, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.